In this presentation, we're going to give an overview of some navigation features within QuickBooks Online. We're going to be using the QuickBooks Online test drive. Easiest way to get there is just simply to Google QuickBooks Online and then go to the test drive, logging into the test drive. It'll typically ask you if you are a computer, and I'm going to say I'm not a robot, and then we're going to continue. And that'll take us to Craig's Design and Landscaping Services. So this is going to be the file that we're going to use, the practice file, the free file, as we practice our navigation. Now, we're not going to change any data as we practice the navigation, but there's already data within the file. So this is a great tool to practice maneuvering around within the QuickBooks file. The homepage of QuickBooks Online gives some useful information, but it's not the primary place that we're going to use to navigate and go through the normal kind of data input process. So you got the setup payments here, send your first invoice type of information on the first page. We have some invoice information down below, expense information, bank account information, profit and loss, and sales information. The primary tools that we will be using to navigate and actually enter data within the system, however, will be over here. You'll see this 3 little lines. They call that a hamburger. So the hamburger, you can close it, and that'll give you more space that you can work with within QuickBooks Online. You can open it, and that's going to give us our major navigations for most of our data input processes. Then we also have the cog over here, the cog up top to the right. That's going to give us information that will be more kind of like permanent type of information, where we have the company information, lists. We'll get into what types of lists are later, tools, and profile information. We will go into more detail with both of these data input items as we go through the course, but just to point out now, those are going to be the primary tools that will be used. When starting new forms, the item up top in the left-hand side that says new is what we're often going to be using. This is going to group the information by customer information, vendors, employees, and other, and it's going to be listing the forms. The forms are going to be the major tool that we will use in order to input data. That form will then be used to create journal entries, basically. The journal entries are the things that are going to affect the financial statements, the income statement or profit and loss, and the balance sheet, as well as other reports. Note that this new icon over here has been adjusted. It's a new placement of the new icon on the left-hand screen. New is to give the new report. That's usually new report, new data input report. That's why it says new. But this little plus icon is in a new place as well. So if you look at prior versions, or if you're looking at instructional videos that are a little bit older, then you're going to see a plus button up here on this side on the upper right of the screen, and that's going to be basically the same menu, pretty much exactly the same menu. So when you're looking at older presentation, you see a plus button down up here, then you're going to go to the new button over here, and you'll see basically the same information laid out in the same format. We also have the help feature, the search feature, and the bell notifications feature up top. Other useful navigation tools that you want to know about as we go through this is that you could increase the size of the screen, and you could do this with many other types of websites, meaning the screen will optimize as you increase the size of it. So one way to do that is if you're on a Windows version, you can hold down Control on your keyboard and use the scrolling up button to scroll up, and you'll note that now I'm at 125% of the screen, and so on and so forth. Now, I'll use this option in order to show and zoom in from time to time. However, I'm not going to do it all the time, because you'll note what happens is QuickBooks is going to optimize the screen for the new size. So when you're looking at your screen, then it might be different. So just note that different sizes and shapes of screens will then make the data input or the data on the screen slightly different. So keep that in mind if you're looking at your screen and you're saying, hey, something's a little bit different. It's formatted a little bit different. They grouped things together possibly. That is because the website is optimizing for whatever size of screen that we are on. Now, the other thing that's nice is that you can work with multiple windows. So possibly you might be in a situation where you're working on one report and then you want to open up another report. And in the desktop version, if you're used to the desktop version, we have something like open windows. Now, this is the desktop version. I'm going to jump back and forth from the desktop version a little bit for a couple different reasons. One is that some people are really used to the desktop version and may be converting to the online version. And we want to be able to see what the differences are and what are the similarities between an online version and desktop version. Also, the desktop version has this really nice on the homepage flowchart. this flowchart really lays out, the normal processes that will be put in place. I'm going to bounce back and forth to this flowchart so that we can see, how the normal processes are. QuickBooks Online doesn't have the flowchart on the first page. You notice it has other kind of useful information here, but it doesn't have that flowchart on basically the home page, and therefore I like to go back here and just look at the flowchart, and this will show the functions, basically the forms that will be entered, and then we can go back to the QuickBooks Online and look for where those forms are. Once you have that flowchart kind of memorized or visualized in your mind, then you don't really need it anymore because you can kind of visualize it. But when you're first learning things and how the system's put together, the flowchart is nice to look at. Now in QuickBooks Desktop, then we have this view feature with open windows, and that allows us to jump back and forth from different windows. So here's the home tab that's open. Here's the profit and loss tab. Here's the balance sheet. So I can have multiple windows open and I can jump back and forth with those multiple windows. And QuickBooks Online, you can't do that quite the same way, but there is a feature that we can do that, and that's to basically create multiple tabs. So when we're back in QuickBooks Online, instead of having the open windows on the left-hand side, we can create multiple tabs up across the top. By doing something like this, we can go onto the first tab, right-click on it, and say I would like to duplicate it. And it should open up another tab with that same information on it, and we can basically open up different reports on the new tab. So if I went back down here and I went to the sales item, we could be navigating through basically the sales screen down below here, and we could be jumping back to the home page here, and we could look at multiple pages. Now, the desktop version also has basically a dual screen feature. So if you had two screens, you might want one item on this screen and one item on another screen, so that you can possibly have basically the reports and then the data input side by side. So you can imagine that it is possible, which you're probably imagining here, maybe, well, how about you open another browser window and we take the URL. I'm going to right click and copy the URL, and then I'm take our other browser and we'll paste that URL, and you can see that we can have basically two screens in that format, and that would be really helpful because you can have two screens with QuickBooks on it, one for your data input, one looking at reports possibly to help you with that data input. So you have kind of similar features, but the way you navigate around those similar features in terms of having multiple windows open, being able to navigate multiple reports at the same time, and being able to have two screens open is going to be functioning differently. Now, of course, as you do this with QuickBooks Online, it also takes more memory and whatnot as you have different browser windows open into this format. As with you're doing QuickBooks Desktop, then you don't even need an internet connection once you have everything set up. So there's differences in the format. If you're used to the desktop version, it's going to take some time to get used to basically having multiple tabs open up top. In other words, if I have a bunch of different reports open, it's going to be a little bit different navigating up top, having all these different tabs open up top, as opposed to if you're used to having just basically the open windows in the open windows section in the desktop version. But once you do that, once you get used to that, and if you have a fast internet connection to allow you to have a bunch of tabs open and possibly different browsers open with QuickBooks on it, which does take some resources to run all the data within QuickBooks, then you can get used to it. So I'm going to go back to the dashboard, back to the first tab. I'm going to go back to the dashboard here. So note again, when you look at the first page here, when you talk about the data input, the first page usually isn't what you're going to be working with most of the time. It's going to be the items on the left-hand side. Now, to get used to what you're going to be doing in terms of the data input, it's useful to visualize the flowchart of what usually happens within an accounting department. And the best tool for that, in my opinion, is the desktop version. So I'm going to jump over to the desktop version and show you the home page once again. So here's the home page. This is a nice tool to just see and visualize what's going to happen typically. Also breaking out the cycles that will happen. And oftentimes, if you're talking about larger organizations, people will be working within these individual cycles. So you can imagine if the larger the organization is, the more separation of duties that you would have. And one of the major separations is by cycle, including the vendor cycle or the payable cycle, the customer cycle, or it might be called the accounts receivable cycle, or the sales cycle, the income or revenue cycle, and then the employee cycle or the payroll cycle. These are all things that could very likely be separated the larger the organization gets. The smaller the organization gets, the more likely one individual will be doing all of these processes. And so what we want to do then is break down our thinking and to be able to visualize basically the normal process that would happen within these cycles. Once we start to think about the normal processes within these cycles, then we want to put our mind really in QuickBooks thinking. And this is going to be something that's different than just normal financial accounting. Financial accounting thinking, we usually think in terms of journal entries, transactions. We'll see those transactions here, but we also need to apply them to the driving tool that will be used in QuickBooks, and those will be the forms. So these icons represent basically forms. These forms typically will make journal entries. So every time we use these forms, it'll make journal entries. Now, if we set up the form data input process correctly, then we can have someone fill out these forms simply doing the data input without understanding the journal entry, without understanding the impact on the financial statements. And that's really what we want. We want to be able to set things up so people can do the day-to-day processes, whatever they need to do, focus on the day-to-day process, enter the data input in a very easy form, and then allow that to process the financial statements as they should be. To do that, we need to understand what these forms are doing, what the journal entry is behind it, what tools are being used in order to make the data input an easy thing to put into the system, and then what's going to be the effect of these forms on the financial statement. So that's what we'll consider, and we'll do that basically one by one in section by section. So we'll think about the vendor section. We'll take a look at the form for entering bills. And whenever we look at a form, such as entering bills, we're going to think, what's the transaction behind that? What's the effect on the balance sheet? What's the effect on the income statement or profit and loss? We'll actually go take a look at that. Then we have the actual pay bill. That's going to be the typical thing that'll happen on the vendor section. You enter a bill and then you pay the bill. And so both of those are considered forms for QuickBooks, which have journal entries that will support them, which will then have two accounts at least affected on the financial statements, balance sheet, income statement. Then we look at the customer side, which you can call the accounts receivable side, the AR side, or the sales side, the revenue side, the income side, that cycle. And the major components there that we're going to be concentrating on will be the create an invoice. So what's going to be the effect of creating an invoice? What kind of tools do we need to create an invoice? The receive payments, and that's when we get paid, and then the record the deposit, which is kind of outside in the banking area, but also in the customer area. And then we could have a situation where we have create the sales receipt, go into the record deposit. So this one has a few more components in it than the vendor cycle, and they have a few different options in it as well. So we'll take some time to consider, why we might have a create sales receipt and how that's different than the invoice down here. And then we'll spend some time with employees and the employee section and the payroll section, which is kind of a specialized area in and of itself. So if you're a small organization, you may not have any employees. If you're a sole proprietor, the larger the organization gets, then you're going to need, of course, the payroll option. Then you got to consider what type of payroll options you need. So we'll think about different kind of payroll options as well. We'll basically have another section of the course that focuses more on payroll and focuses in on it because it's typically an add-on. You got to pay more for it if you want QuickBooks support. And there's other options for payroll as well. So we'll talk about those items as we get to the payroll items. Once we see what these items are, we see them in the flowchart and we can visualize these flowcharts, then I would jump back over to QuickBooks and say, okay, now let me see if I can find these items within QuickBooks. So if I, for example, want to make an invoice, that's going to be in the sales section, and then we can basically go to the invoicing. Now, QuickBooks has different options to get to basically the same place. For example, another way to get to the invoice is to select the new item up top, the plus button, and then you would go into the customer section, and then you would go to invoice. So you want to know the different ways to get to different places, because when you're working with other people and talking to other people, then they might do something a bit differently, but you need to recognize that it's going to be the same thing. We'll get into more detail about that as we start to navigate through each of these major sections. So sometimes when you look in QuickBooks, you have different options to get to the same place. And one of the reasons we're going to update this course, from time to time is because QuickBooks format and layout for the online, QuickBooks Online could just change things. If you look at the QuickBooks Online this year as to 3 years ago, the format of it will look different. And so the way you're going to data input will look different. However, the basic functioning of QuickBooks is pretty straightforward because you're going to have those kind of forms. So the QuickBooks desktop version, this flowchart here, changes much more slowly. Yeah. So the desktop version, has had this basically flowchart and these forms laid out, at least in this way, on the homepage for a long time. And therefore, it's useful to look at this and then go to QuickBooks Online and say, all right, where did they put it on QuickBooks Online? And many of the features they do on QuickBooks Online, they've tested them out. They're testing new things out, and they're always improving QuickBooks Online. So I'm not saying it's a bad thing that it changes a lot. It's probably a good thing. And what works they stick with, and what doesn't they don't. But that it does mean that the QuickBooks Online is still going through a lot of evolutionary changes, and it changes a whole lot more than the desktop version. However, the basic functions and features of the accounting cycle as it relates to the flowchart here on the desktop version will remain much the same. So if you keep this flowchart in your head, as things change, you can then go into QuickBooks Online and be able to basically navigate through and find those forms that you need to find in order to then create the transactions and the journal entries that will then impact the financial statements in a way that we'll describe later. And of course, this course obviously will also be updated so that you can see the changes. Like you can go back to 2018 and where we've had the course in 2018 and say, well, where did this go? How did it look then? And possibly if you need more help in other types of things, and that you're looking at older videos and instructions, you could see how the format has changed in 2018 to now. And as things change going forward, we'll make the updates to the courses as well periodically, so you can get a fresh view of what the current face of QuickBooks Online looks like.